In Long Beach, California, in the summer of 1968, a tournament was held inside a concrete exhibition hall that smelled of floor wax and canvas, and the particular kind of quiet that builds before something irreversible happens. The hall seated 400 people. Every seat was taken. Another 60 stood along the back wall, shoulders touching, programs folded in their hands. The overhead lights ran in two long parallel rows, and they cast a flat, even light across the competition floor, a light that forgave nothing and softened nothing, and made every man look exactly as he was. The man who walked through the side entrance at 7:43 in the evening was not recognized by anyone near the door. He was 28 years old and stood 5 feet 10 inches in street shoes. He wore a plain white t-shirt and dark slacks, and carried a canvas bag over his left shoulder. His hair was cut close, and his face was still. He found a seat in the 4th row from the back, set the bag beneath his chair, and sat with both hands resting on his knees. He did not look at the scoreboard. He did not look at the ring. He watched the door on the far side of the hall with a patience that had no particular destination. Nobody in that building knew who he was. Not the tournament director, who was standing at the scoring table in a pressed white gi with 3 black stripes on the lapel. Not the 6 senior karate instructors seated in the judges' row, who had between them won 41 regional and national titles. Not the 211 competitors warming up on the side mats. Not one of them knew that the quiet man in the 4th row from the back had already fought 62 tournament bouts and had not lost a single one. In the next 47 seconds, in front of 400 witnesses, the sport of American karate would change its shape permanently. Only one man in that hall understood that before it happened. That man was Chuck Norris. The evening's featured competitor was a fighter named Roland Cade. That name may not land with immediate weight today. But in the summer of 1968, Roland Cade was the most credentialed point karate competitor in the western United States, and the holder of a record that no one in that room had come close to matching. He was 24 years old. He stood 6 feet 1 inch and weighed 207 pounds, which at that time was unusually large for a tournament competitor. His reach measured 78 inches from fingertip to fingertip. He had won his last 19 consecutive tournament bouts. He had been featured in 2 martial arts publications. His instructor, a 3rd-generation Okinawan lineage teacher named Sato, had stated publicly in print that Roland Cade was the finest natural athlete he had trained in 30 years of teaching. Cade's technique was not flashy. It was something rarer and more dangerous. It was economical. He threw the reverse punch from a stance so low and grounded that seasoned instructors along the judges' row had been watching him warm up for 20 minutes and had said nothing to one another, which, in that community, was its own form of praise. He had a front kick that landed before the opponent registered the hip shift. He had a back knuckle strike that he threw from a dead stop, with no preparatory motion at all. He had won bouts in 9 seconds. He had won bouts in 2 seconds. He did not waste effort. He read distance the way some men read rooms. He also had one flaw. And it was the kind of flaw that does not announce itself until the exact wrong moment. At 8:21 in the evening, after his 2nd exhibition match of the night, Roland Cade was handed a microphone by the tournament host. This was standard practice. Champions were invited to address the hall. Most said something gracious and brief. Cade held the microphone with one hand and looked out at the seated audience with an expression that belonged to a man who had been told too many times that he was exceptional. He said that the state of American karate had a problem. He said the problem was that the men being celebrated in certain circles had not been tested. He said that reputation was not the same as ability, and that some reputations in this room were built more on story than on performance. He did not name a name. He did not need to. His eyes moved once, briefly, toward the fourth row from the back. The hall went still in the way that a hall goes still only when everyone present understands simultaneously that something has just shifted. At the scoring table, the tournament director, a man named Gerald Hines, who had been running competitions for 11 years, set his pen down flat on the table. He did not pick it up again for 4 minutes. If you have never watched someone swallow a room with silence, it is difficult to explain the specific quality of the quiet that followed. It was not the quiet of an empty space. It was the quiet of 400 people choosing, all at once, not to speak. In the fourth row from the back, Chuck Norris looked at his hands. Then he stood up. He stood up without urgency. He reached into the canvas bag beneath his seat and removed his competition gi top. He folded his white t-shirt once, precisely, and set it on the seat of the chair. He put on the gi top and tied the belt with 2 clean movements. He did not roll his shoulders. He did not stretch his neck. He did not shake his hands loose at the wrist. He picked up the canvas bag, set it under the chair, and began to walk toward the front of the hall. The recognition moved through the crowd in a way that several witnesses would later describe in almost identical terms. Independently, without having spoken to one another. It moved like something passing beneath the surface of water, first one row, then the next, then the next. A current of understanding that rolled from the back of the room to the front as people leaned toward their neighbors and said a name, and then the neighbor said it louder, and then the row behind them said it loudest of all. By the time Chuck Norris reached the edge of the competition floor, the entire hall knew who he was. Roland Cade still had the microphone in his hand. He had already lost. He simply did not know it yet. If you want to know what happened in the next 47 seconds, every movement, every decision, every inch of space, make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. This channel exists because of the people who stay until the end. What most people have never understood about Chuck Norris in competition is that he did not fight the man in front of him. He fought the geometry of the space between them. Every instructor who had watched him train, every sparring partner who had faced him in a closed gym, every judge who had scored his bouts would say some version of the same thing. He saw the room differently. He saw lines and angles and closing distances where other fighters saw opponents. The opponent was almost incidental. What Norris managed was space. A fight, at its technical foundation, is not 2 men striking each other. A fight is a continuous argument about distance. The man who controls the range controls every option available to both parties. He decides when contact is possible. He decides when it is not. He decides whether a technique lands or misses before either man has committed to it, because the decision happens in the geometry. 3 full steps before the strike is thrown. Most fighters learn this conceptually. Very few ever inhabit it physically. Chuck Norris had been inhabiting it since 1961. He stepped onto the floor at 8:23. Roland Cade handed the microphone back to the host and turned. The 2 men stood facing each other at a distance of approximately 11 feet. The overhead lights caught the surface of the floor between them and held it flat and still. Someone in the crowd coughed once, and then the hall was silent again. Cade bowed. Norris bowed. Then Cade moved. Second one. Cade closed the 11-foot gap with 3 rapid steps and launched the reverse punch that had ended 19 consecutive bouts. It left his hip at full rotation with his body weight committed behind it. The speed of it was, by any reasonable measure, exceptional. The 6 judges in the front row who had been watching tournament karate for a combined total of 64 years would later agree on this without qualification. The punch was technically perfect. It landed on air. Norris had moved laterally by 8 inches. Not back, not away, sideways, and only 8 inches, which was precisely 8 inches more than the punch needed to miss, and precisely 0 inches more than necessary. The movement was so small that 3 people in the front row did not see it happen. They only saw that the punch had missed. In the 3rd seat of the judges' row, a man named Victor Park, who held a 6th-degree black belt in Tong Sudo and had been one of Chuck Norris's earliest tournament opponents, sat with his right hand covering his mouth. He had recognized what he was watching before the first second was finished. Second 4. Cade reset and threw the back knuckle strike from the dead stop, the technique that had no preparatory motion. The one that coaches in 3 states had spent months trying to teach their students to read. It reached the space where Norris's jaw had been. Norris's jaw was no longer there. He had leaned back by a distance that a watching student estimated afterward as 3 inches, which was 3 inches of the most economical defensive movement that the student had seen in 7 years of competition. The tournament director, Gerald Hines, had his hands flat on the scoring table. He had not moved them since he set the pen down. Second 9. Cade threw the front kick, the technique he had landed on every opponent he had faced in 2 years of competition, the kick that arrived before the opponent registered the hip shift. He threw it from a stance that gave nothing away. His hip loaded invisibly. The kick extended at full speed toward the center line. Norris checked it. Not blocked. Checked, the specific defensive tool that redirects rather than absorbs, that uses the opponent's committed energy as the beginning of a conversation rather than a problem to be solved. The check caught the kicking leg at the shin, altered its path by 4 degrees, and simultaneously opened the entire right side of Cade's body for the single count of a heartbeat. That heartbeat was sufficient. What happened next occurred inside 1 second. Norris's weight transferred forward. His right foot moved once, placing him at a distance of 22 inches from Cade's center line, closer than Cade's range, farther than grappling distance. The precise empty corridor where a man with fast hands and a controlled hip can do exactly what he chooses. His right hand moved in a compact arc that contained almost no warning motion whatsoever. The spinning back kick that followed was not, technically, the decisive technique of the exchange. The decisive technique had happened 14 seconds earlier, when Norris established the angle from which every subsequent movement became available to him. The back kick was simply the conclusion of a geometric argument that had been finished long before the kick was thrown. It stopped 1 inch from Roland Cade's left temple. 1 inch. The gap held for a full second while the hall processed what had just happened. The kick was there, and then it was withdrawn, and Cade stood exactly where he had stood, unmarked, with his eyes focused on a middle distance that had no object in it. In the back row of the hall, a young student named Marcus Webb, 17 years old, attending his first senior tournament on a borrowed admission ticket, would spend the next 31 years teaching his own students about the moment he had witnessed. He would tell them that the hardest thing in a competition is to stop a committed technique 1 inch short of its target. He would tell them that most fighters, in the moment of executing a finishing strike, cannot stop it. The momentum, the adrenal commitment, the full investment of weight and rotation, these things do not stop easily. To stop them at 1 inch requires that the fighter has not, at any point, lost his own awareness of where he is. It requires a quality of self-possession that exists entirely outside of anger or arousal or competitive desire. He would call it, in his own school, the only move that matters. Norris withdrew the kick and lowered his hand. Roland Cade had not moved. For a moment that no witness was able to time with any certainty, some said 3 seconds, some said 7. One man said closer to 15. Nothing happened at all. The hall held its breath the way a hall does when it has watched something it was not prepared to see. Then Norris stepped forward and extended his right hand. Cade looked at it. The fork in the road that every defeated man must eventually face is not a public one. It does not announce itself with signs. It arrives in the body first, in the chest, in the throat. Before it reaches the face or the hands, a man can be observed in the moment he reaches it, if the observer knows where to look, but he cannot be guided through it. He goes one way or the other entirely on his own. Roland Cade looked at the extended hand for 3 seconds. Then he took it. He shook it once, firmly, without speaking. His jaw was set, and his expression was not the expression of a man who was happy, but it was the expression of a man who had chosen something difficult over something easy. That distinction matters. It was the only decision he made that evening that no one in the hall could have predicted. Norris leaned forward and said something. He said it quietly enough that no witness in the hall heard the words. The 2 men standing closest to the exchange, Victor Park in the judge's row and the tournament host still holding the microphone at the edge of the floor, both reported hearing the tone of it, but not the content. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. What he said was not confirmed publicly until 1997, when Roland Cade gave a single interview to a small circulation martial arts periodical. He was 43 years old by then, and running a school in Scottsdale, Arizona, he had not competed since 1971. The interviewer asked him about Long Beach. Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, he said that Norris had told him, "In those 4 seconds, you are better than tonight. Come back when you know it." The interview ran to 3 paragraphs on an inside page. Victor Park, having stood from his seat in the judge's row, walked to the edge of the floor and waited as Chuck Norris turned to leave. He put one hand briefly on Norris's left shoulder as he passed. A contact that lasted no more than 2 seconds, the kind of contact that requires no explanation between men who have spent long years in the same art. He said nothing. Norris nodded once and continued toward the back of the hall. He reached the 4th row. He took the canvas bag from beneath the chair. He walked out through the side entrance. The door closed behind him with the small, flat sound of a latch catching. The hall stood in silence for approximately 7 seconds. Then, the applause started at the back, where the standing crowd had watched without obstruction, and it moved forward through the seats in a wave that crested at the front row and held for 40 seconds. Gerald Hines, the tournament director, was still standing at the scoring table. He picked up his pen. He wrote nothing. He set it down again. In the weeks that followed, the story moved through the martial arts community of the Western United States the way stories of that kind move, laterally, through dojos and gyms and the parking lots outside tournaments, carried by people who had been present, and by people who knew people who had been present, and, eventually, by people who had only heard the account at second or third remove and were filling in the gaps with whatever their own experience supplied. The story was already changing by the second week. In some versions, the fight lasted 30 seconds. In others, it lasted 3 minutes. In at least one version circulating in a San Jose dojo, Norris had thrown 17 techniques. In another, he had thrown none. The versions that multiplied fastest were not the ones that were most accurate. They were the ones that contained the detail people most needed the story to contain. What did not change, across any version, in any city, across any number of retellings, was the image of the kick stopped 1 inch short. That part was invariant. Everyone who repeated the story kept that part intact, because that was the part that was not about technique. That was the part that was about something else. Victor Park told the story to his own students for decades. He told it not as a lesson about fighting. He told it as a lesson about economy. The idea that the most powerful statement a man can make in a room is the one he withholds. Roland Cade, in his Scottsdale school, told it differently. He told it to his advanced students as a lesson about the difference between reputation and presence. He told them that the most dangerous thing a man can do in competition is believe that his record precedes him into the room. The record stays outside, he told them. The room does not care about the record. The room only cares what you do when you are in it. Marcus Webb, the 17-year-old who had attended on a borrowed ticket and stood in the back row, became a teacher himself in 1983. He ran a school in Tucson for 22 years. He told the story every time he had a new class of intermediate students, the same class of students who had learned enough technique to begin confusing confidence with understanding. He told it once with the specific detail that Chuck Norris had not rolled his shoulders. He did not know why that detail stayed with him above all the others. Something about it seemed like the point. The Long Beach tournament of 1968 does not appear in most accounts of Chuck Norris's career. It was not a title bout. It was not a scheduled match. It was an unplanned exchange that lasted 47 seconds on a floor that had not been prepared for it. By most measurable standards, it should not have mattered as much as it did. What it mattered as, in the end, was an argument about what the sport was actually for. Point karate in 1968 was a sport of records and credentials, and the accumulation of documented victories. It was governed by scorekeepers and bound by the logic of the ledger. What happened in Long Beach that evening was a different kind of demonstration. It was a demonstration of the principle that sits underneath all the records, the one the records are supposed to be pointing toward, but sometimes, in the accumulation of them, begin to obscure. Chuck Norris did not win a title in Long Beach. He did not add a line to his record. He walked into a hall and stood in the fourth row and waited to be needed, and then went forward when the moment arrived and did what he had spent 7 years preparing to do. And then he walked back out through the same door he had entered. The world outside was indifferent. The traffic on Long Beach Boulevard continued. A forklift was moving crates in a lot 4 blocks away. The late summer air sat flat and warm against the concrete face of the exhibition hall. Inside, 400 people were deciding what they had just witnessed. The answer they arrived at, separately and together, in the weeks and months and decades that followed, was this: that the measure of a man who has mastered something is not the force with which he applies it. It is the precision with which he chooses not to. What Roland Cade said in that single interview in 1997, when the journalist asked him whether he regretted the speech he had given into the microphone on the night of August the 14th, the speech that had opened the door to everything that followed, was a single sentence. He paused for a long moment before he said it. He said, "I do not regret it. I only regret that it took me until the floor of that room to learn what I should have known walking in." A man who knows what he can do rarely needs to say it. The man who says it loudest in the room is almost always the man who has just discovered the distance between the story he tells himself and the one the room is about to tell for him. Next week on this channel, the story of the afternoon in 1974 when Chuck Norris walked onto a film lot in Burbank and was told by the production's stunt coordinator, a man with 19 years of professional credits, that what he was planning to do on camera was not physically possible. What happened in the next 11 minutes changed the way Hollywood filmed martial arts for the following 3 decades. That story has never been told in full. We will tell it in full. Subscribe now, and we will see you there.